Investors who own properties in Queensland, as well as other states, are set to be slugged with massive land tax bills following the introduction of a new tax regime in Queensland. New legislation was passed on the 24th of June, which allows the Queensland Government to include the value of investment properties owned in other states when working out how much land tax to charge on Queensland properties. Now, I think this is outrageous, and I'm surprised it's even legal, but the state government of Queensland, which has become renowned for its shady dealings, has tried to justify it with political doublespeak. In announcing the proposed changes, the Queensland Treasurer Cameron Dick, and if you want to know what he's like, there's a clue in his surname, said the new measures would close a land tax loophole. The property industry has slammed the move as purely a cash grab, which will deter investment in Queensland and worsen the already dire rental crisis. The changes take effect from the 1st of January next year and will be applied to land tax assessments in the 2023-24 tax year. Now, Cameron Dick said because some investors had portfolios spread across different states, they were able to avoid land tax by owning assets below tax-free thresholds in different states. He said the changes meant that people based outside of Queensland who own properties in Queensland would now be treated the same as Queenslanders. He said if investors only own land in Queensland and nowhere else, they will not be affected by the changes. So apparently it's now a crime to own real estate in more than one state, and you need to be punished for it. And anyone who owns investment properties in multiple states as well as Queensland will be affected by the change, whether they live in Queensland or whether they live in another state. Showing the deceptive doublespeak for which politicians are renowned, Dick says, you'll only pay tax on the land you own in Queensland. That is, we're not taxing your land outside of Queensland. But if you own land in Queensland and in another state or territory, you will need to declare your interstate land holdings. Technically, I suppose he's right. You don't pay land tax on your interstate properties, but your interstate properties massively affect the rate of land tax you will pay in Queensland under this new regime. And the end result is the same. You end up being hit with a massive increase in tax. Here's the state government's own example, which shows that land tax charges are set to soar. Before the regime change that we're about to be hit with, an investor who owned land in Queensland with a taxable value of, say, $745,000 and also land in Victoria worth $1.56 million, they would be charged under the current regime a little under $2,000 in annual land tax, as the state government only took into account the Queensland property that investor owned. But under the new regime, the total value of their holdings, including the Victorian property, will be $2.31 million. The new calculation to work out the land tax is extremely complicated, but here's the end result. Under the new land tax regime, that same property owner who previously paid just $2,000 in land tax will now pay over $8,000 in land tax because their assessment will include the property that they own in Victoria. Now, the Real Estate Institute of Queensland Chief Executive, Antonia Mercarella, has branded the change a slap in the face to the one sector that's propping up the state's economy. She adds that the Queensland Government did not consult with relevant property stakeholder groups before making its decision and its announcement. And she says this treatment of property investors as an endless money pit is outrageous. The state government is raking in a huge stamp duty windfall, then relying on private investors to provide the lion's share of housing supply, and now they're slapping investors yet again with new taxes. How can the government possibly justify slugging property investors with tax for land they own that isn't even within the state's borders? She says it's utter nonsense that there is a loophole to close. Now, Mercarella says no other state or territory takes this approach to land tax, and she's concerned it will deter people from investing in Queensland. And of course, she's right. It will deter people from buying in Queensland, and it will compel some investors who own property in Queensland to sell their properties. And that will mean that the rental shortage in Queensland, which is already dire, will get even worse and rents will rise further. which means it will be residential tenants who will pay the price for the greed and stupidity of the Queensland State Government. Property Council Queensland Executive Director Jen Williams has labelled the new measure as nothing more than a tax grab. She says, not only will this new land tax see individuals penalised for owning property in Queensland, they will also be taxed twice for any property owned in another state. Given that the state is in the midst of a housing supply and affordability challenge and is unable to fill critically skilled positions across the labour market, Queensland needs all the people and investment it can get. She says, with the second highest land tax rates in the country already and a penchant for finding new ways to tax the housing industry, Queensland faces the risk of detracting the core elements it needs to leverage the decade of opportunity ahead. And it's all very true, in my view. Now, let's be clear. Queensland, like the rest of Australia, has a dire rental shortage crisis. The shortage has been created by a series of political decisions over the past 5 years, which have deterred Australians from buying investment properties. Queensland's just brought in new residential tenancy laws, which are favourable to tenants and detrimental to property owners, which makes the situation worse. And now the new land tax rules could potentially create a situation where there are zero vacancies across Queensland. In other words, no properties available for rental at all. People who need to rent will have nowhere to live, and businesses trying to fill vacant job positions won't be able to, because willing workers won't be able to find anywhere to live in that area. It's a dire situation, and the idiot politicians who run the state of Queensland are working extremely hard to make it considerably worse.